Welcome to a Better Divorce podcast, where we have conversations about the emotional, financial, and legal issues that are on your mind or should be on your radar if your goal is to keep your divorce out of court. I'm collaborative divorce attorney and mediator Andrea Vaca, and I know that how you divorce matters to your long-term well-being. That's why it's my mission to help you have a better divorce with as little acrimony as possible, so that you can create the best life possible on the other side of your marriage. Hello, I'm thrilled to have Dr. Gold Buscho on the Better Divorce podcast today. Dr. Buscho is a licensed clinical psychologist who specializes in family issues related to divorce, parenting planning, co-parenting counseling, everything to do with parenting. And she's passionate about helping parents divorce respectfully so that the entire family can heal and thrive after divorce. Her book is The Parent's Guide to Birdnesting, a child-centered solution to co-parenting during separation and divorce. And it was published by Simon & Schuster in September 2020. And one other thing I want to mention is that she has a column in Psychology Today that happens to be called A Better Divorce. So, and great minds think alike. Welcome to A Better Divorce podcast.
I'm very glad to be here. And the fact that you're a collaborative lawyer makes us kind of kindred spirits, because I work almost exclusively with collaborative divorce cases.
Yeah, I can see that in everything in your writing and your columns and your website. It's clear that we're, so like-minded around what that process can bring to a family when it's transitioning from married to unmarried. So I'm really excited to have this conversation with you today. This is the first time we're talking about nesting on the podcast. So I wanted to have you on because so many parents consider this, and it's a great option, but there's also challenges with it. So I was really hoping, to kind of dig into that with you today. So who better to ask than the person who wrote the book on it?
Yeah. Well, the book came about because Simon & Schuster sort of foresaw that nesting would be a trending topic. And I had written a blog about it in 2014. So 10 years ago now, just about. And my ex and I had nested in 1994, so even longer ago. And so that's almost 30 years ago, which is kind of scary. But we had no clue what we were doing. It was just suggested to us. So I learned a lot from that experience. And as time went on and I talked to more and more of my clients about nesting, I began to put together ideas about what works and what doesn't work and what would really help make the nesting experience successful.
Right. Yeah. So your own experience, the clients you worked with, and then Simon Schuster came calling. So I guess you just gathered all your notes and your experiences and started working on the book. So let's define exactly what nesting is. How do you define it?
So nesting is an arrangement that parents agree on where the children stay in one home. And generally that's the primary home where they've been raised. And the parents take turns being on and off duty according to some kind of prearranged schedule that they've agreed on. The biggest stress that when I talk to people is about, the thing that I stress the most is having a documented agreement, and rather than just sort of winging it. And so this thing that they've pre-agreed on, the schedule, is very specific. It becomes part of the parenting plan.
And whether they're doing this in an interim basis before the final agreement is signed, or it's going to be part of the final agreement, you encourage them not to just wing it, get it, but to actually have it in writing and make sure there's a schedule, agreements on how they'll do this. Right?
Yeah.
So where and when.
Sure. The big questions that come up are, where do parents go when they're off duty? And how long do they do this for? Because sometimes people will do it for a month or two and then they think they failed because they just did it for a short time. And I believe that even if you only do it for a short time, you're giving the separation and or divorce a softer startup for the kids.
Right.
It's an easier transition for them. So I encourage people to do it for as long as they can. Sometimes they will do it until the divorce is done, or until the house is sold, or until the school year is over. But it doesn't, however long parents do it will benefit the children and benefit them actually as well. And then did you want me to talk a little bit about where parents go when they're not on duty?
Well, yeah, but first, before I would definitely like to talk about that. I'd like to know a little bit more about your experience with it.
Mhm.
Like where did you go? What did you do? What did you try different ways? Trial. Was there some trial and error, or you and your spouse decided this is what we're going to do, and we stuck with it? So, can you just tell a little bit about your own experience
Sure,
with it?
sure. Well, like most people, we didn't have enough money to go and buy another home or two homes or two apartments or whatever. So what I did was I got a room in a shared rental. So I had 5 roommates. It was like going back to college days, but it was actually, for me, it was good because I had a little bit of support, and I wasn't alone when I was off duty and missing my kids.
Mhm.
And my ex-husband had a girlfriend at the time, so he stayed with her. And we nested for 15 months. And what brought the nesting to an end was when he wanted her to move into the house. And we had already decided that he was going to keep the house. So I don't think it ended well, which I write about how to end it,
Mhm.
but that's why it ended.
Okay. So sometimes it ends naturally because life happens, and sometimes it's a pre-arranged,
Yes.
plan. But your book does go into why it's becoming more common. I mean, you said Simon and Schuster like saw some trends, I guess, and I definitely have seen that in my own practice. I knew people back 20, 30 years ago who were nesting, and people have always talked about it. But more people are more open to it, whether it's on a very temporary basis or a long-term plan. Um, and so why do you think it's becoming more popular now? Why are we hearing about it more?
I think people are more and more aware of putting their children ahead of their own relationship emotions. I think most parents will agree on one thing, that they love their children and they want to protect them as best as possible. So I do think that, especially after conscious uncoupling came out, and people have talked a little bit more about what kids need, I think that's driving it. I also think finances are driving it. I also think some people aren't really sure when they nest whether they're going to reconcile or go ahead and divorce. So that gives them time to think about that without disrupting the children's lives.
Yeah, that gives them space from each other.
Mhm,
And,
mhm.
and so I I I had clients that knew they wanted to divorce, um, and the wife did have the finances to go buy another home. So they had 2 homes, but their son wouldn't leave the home. Quite.
Oh,
He was of
right.
an age where he just wasn't going anywhere.
Mhm.
So, they didn't realize this until after she had spent a lot of money on this new home. So they had to nest out of necessity because the son just was never going to come stay with mom. So they ended up nesting, and I wish they had had a book like this. It was a little before COVID this happened.
Yeah,
Um, you know, to really think through, was it the best plan? Because I know
yeah,
it's very,
yeah,
very hard on them, and they did it for 2 years
yeah,
until he was out of high school.
yeah.
So it can be very hard on the parents, and your book has a checklist about, how to help parents decide if it's right for their family.
Yes.
So what are, and you have like positive signs and red flags. And so can you just talk a little bit about that? Like how a couple might be able to say, oh, this might work for us versus it won't.
There has to be just a minimum of respect.
Okay.
By the time people are talking about separation and divorce, there's often very little goodwill, but there has to be a way to come together around parenting. And that even parents with different parenting styles can come together around protecting children from fallout from the divorce. And during COVID, so I wrote the book before COVID started. During COVID, a lot of people had to nest because they were locked down and they had planned to separate. And these are people who really had no forethought about nesting, but were forced into it. And it was, I think, a good experience for most of them because they realized that it did benefit the kids. And they had to come up with all sorts of different ways of rearranging things in order to make nesting possible within one home. But did I answer your question?
No. Well, what are some of the good signs? You need a minimum of respect between you.
Yeah, there has to be a modicum of respect. There has to be a willingness to sit down and make agreements and keep them. And so a lot of people will make agreements but not keep them. So it's really important to not agree to something unless you think you can keep it. They have to be willing to talk about what happens if things go wrong for some reason. They have to be willing to predict difficult circumstances. I mean, the big ones are things like dating or new relationships and having agreements about how the primary home is kept. Is that only for the children, or can they bring new relationships into the home? They need to be able to communicate with each other, whether that's in writing or texting or verbally. I think that if people are interested in nesting and they understand how it benefits the kids, and they have difficulty sitting down to draft a nesting agreement, they can get somebody like you or me to help them put together such an agreement.
Think it through. Like with the communication, you know, we don't want them communicating through the children. You're not leaving messages with, the children, like when your dad gets back, tell him this, right? Like you want to leave them out of it. But being able to basically follow through, respect each other's needs and wants and prior agreements. That's absolutely necessary.
And respect each other's privacy as well. Yes. So if people are nesting, then a lot of times important documents are in the house, maybe computers are in the house. They need to have a conversation about how to respect each other's privacy, about what condition to leave the house in when they leave. I've had some people have, 5-page grocery lists that, the refrigerator must be stocked before the changeover happens. I don't think that's particularly helpful, but I do think some basic staples, and that don't leave a sink full of dishes, maybe change the bed before you move back, before you move out and the other parent comes back in.
Right. There's all these things that you might not think about. So having a checklist or talking to somebody who's been through it or has worked with other clients and have seen where the landmines are, that they'll eventually realize they should have talked about, we can help them look forward.
Right. And that checklist is in the book.
Right.
Yeah.
And some red flags, I noticed there was a lot about if there's alcohol or drugs, one or both are using them, you're fighting around, when you're using them. There's been domestic violence. Those are kind of the big red flags, big, bright red flags. But what are some others that people should probably be aware of that this may not be the right fit for them?
If people really can't control their rage in front of the children, that would be a red flag. Untreated mental illness would be a red flag. Untreated addiction would be a red flag. There are some people really just can't see sharing the home with the person they're going to divorce. And if they really can't see themselves accommodating to and sort of compromising and sacrificing where they need to prioritize the children, then they shouldn't do it. And I've had situations where one parent badly wanted to nest and the other parent just wasn't willing. And I'm sure you've seen that too.
Yeah. You can't force this. It has to be a mutual agreement. It's not something you can try to convince somebody of. I absolutely agree. And you can try it with baby steps, like moving to the basement or, try nesting while living together before moving apart. But some people just don't want to do it. And that's okay. It's not going to be the right fit. I completely agree with that.
I mean, some people, before they even show up in your office or my office, have already started maybe sleeping in separate bedrooms or detaching emotionally in some way or other. So in a sense, that's the first step. And if they could come to an agreement about an on-duty, off-duty schedule and formalize that, then they could nest. And like I said earlier, even if they just nest for a very short time, it gives everybody time to cool off, calm down, kind of transition to this new way of thinking about their family structure.
Yes. Yeah, the kids get used to being with one parent at a time. The parents get a little space from each other. The tensions can come down in the home. It doesn't have to be a forever situation.
Right.
I before we started the call, I told you that I like to think about when people are in the nest, and then when they're not in the nest, the parents are on their perch, right? Where are they perching? That's how and you said nobody else uses this term, so I guess I made it up. But I like the idea of that. So you're leaving the nest, you're going, where will you perch? Where will you stay? You found a home with other roommates, and that worked really well for you. What are you seeing other parents are doing?
Huge variety. Some people nest within their home, and they might even sort of restructure their home, put kids together in one bedroom, so that they create a bedroom for the off-duty parent. That makes it a little complicated in terms of agreeing about when they're in the kitchen, for example, or their interactions. I've seen parents sleep at their office with a fold-out couch. I had one gentleman who had a pastor who allowed him to stay in his office, had a couch, and he stayed there for quite some time. I've had people stay with friends and family and couch surf for a while. I've had, if people can afford it, they can share an apartment offsite, and again, that's a separate agreement about how that apartment is used. But they could share an offsite studio, or if they have the means to have two offsite studios. And of course, that's the most expensive way to go, but it also gives each parent the most independence.
Yeah, it depends on, your financial situation, of course.
Mm-hmm.
But you also have to think about how productive will you be at work and in parenting and all the other things you have to, and your divorce that you might be going through while you're doing this. So, you really have to think ahead as to what will make you comfortable too. It's
Yeah.
not just about the children.
There was a show on ABC called Splitting Up Together, and it was a sitcom, and it ran for a couple of seasons, and then it left. But that was a nesting family. And what they did was they converted the garage into an apartment.
Yeah.
And the off-duty parent went to the garage. I think people can think out of the box to come up with solutions that aren't necessarily exorbitantly expensive. It all comes back to, what are you willing to do to protect your children from the stress of the divorce? And can you do it in a way that you also take care of yourself and give yourself time to collect yourself emotionally, maybe give yourself time to explore reconciliation or not, or to find out where you're going to stand financially post-divorce, which is, I think, why we nested, was we didn't know how we would stand post-divorce. So we wanted to have all of that figured out before we moved to separate homes.
Right. Like what are you doing with the former family home? Will you be selling it? Will you each have money to go buy something or rent something else? Or will one person need time to refinance that they can buy the other person out? You don't always know these things. You never know these things immediately. You need time for it. So this is such a great option, especially as we talked about for the kids. But so as people are thinking about nesting and their lives are moving on, they're starting to meet new people. Maybe this is post-divorce now. They've separated and divorced, and they want to start dating. So what do you tell people to look out for before they start moving into this before they move into this next phase of their life? What challenges should they expect, and what have you seen happen?
Well, I mean, a significant number of divorces, as you know, often start because there's an affair. There's already a new relationship. And I always start with what kids need. kids are not ready to meet anybody new or accept anybody new in their lives for quite some time after the divorce, generally at least a year. A healthy child who was pretty stable before the divorce will kind of be more resilient and be pretty recovered after a year. But many children need more, 2 years or more. So kids aren't ready to meet people. So the place that I would start is you never bring dates or new relationships into the family home when you're nesting. You have all your off-duty time to date and to explore new relationships. If you're already in one, or if you want to get online and start dating, all of that is fine. You're entitled to have a personal life when you're off duty, but don't bring dates or new relationships into the home. Kids are incredibly perceptive. If you bring somebody in and say, oh, this is my friend, kids know. They pick that up immediately. So the story that I wrote about in the book was a couple that had not discussed this issue before they started nesting, and the wife came home one day and found a used condom in the bedroom. And that kind of that caused a big blow up.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of ways to blow up nesting, but that's one of the worst. So I always ask people to include very clear guidelines about dating and new relationships in their nesting agreement.
And you would suggest not just a guideline, but like a red line, like you will not do this. You will not. There's plenty of time to do this, when you're off duty and you have your
don't introduce your kids to new people so soon, because the fact that you're happy in a new relationship doesn't mean they will be happy. And in fact, they're more likely to sabotage the relationship. And I've had all kinds of counter arguments to that. Well, I don't want to continue if my kids don't like them. Well, don't start until the kids have had a chance to kind of transition and adapt to having two single parents.
Right. Yeah, I think I see, the new partner will put pressure. I want to meet your kids. I want to move this forward. And in a way, if you've already agreed with your ex, like, yeah, well, I'm not going to introduce the children until I'm at a certain point in my relationship, or whether we're this far apart away from our signed agreement, or we've been separated X amount of time. The date of the divorce doesn't really matter to the children. They don't know. But how long have they been in their world separate? Have the children been separated? That's really
Right.
the timeline, right? Think
I mean,
about.
the reason is that, most relationships break up within the first year. So if your kids really like the new person and they get attached to them and then they break up, it's another loss for the kids. It's kind of one loss after another. And I know someone who, for 10 years after the divorce, he had a series of relationships, but none of them lasted more than a year. But every time the kids were introduced, and some of them they got quite attached to. So, this was devastating for them. Some of them left in the middle of the night without ever saying goodbye. I mean, it was really so destructive for them. So, as happy as you may be in your new relationship, don't assume that your kids are going to be happy for you. Or I've heard a lot of myths about, well, if I'm happy, my kids will be happy. It actually doesn't hold true.
And you have to find ways to be happy and be the best parent you can be, or, regardless of your personal relationships. You have to put your children first.
Yeah.
So knowing that people want to eventually be dating again, and nesting might not be the forever arrangement if you're going to have this kind of agreement where you can't bring your new partner into your home. What are some ways that people think, you've seen people think about when to end the nesting period?
Mm-hmm.
What?
Yeah, when to end it. Sometimes people have a specific milestone in mind, and sometimes life happens, as you said earlier, and they decide that it's time to end. I counsel people to give their partner at least 3 months notice, 90 days notice, so that they have time to get, their life reorganized.
Mm-hmm.
And that usually, if people are keeping their agreements, that's a good agreement to keep. You asked a question about other ways that nesting can go wrong, and the dating and new relationships is a good example of big one. But the way nesting goes wrong often is just people not keeping their agreements. And that, and so for example, I worked with one couple where the wife signed the children up for extracurriculars. And when the husband was on duty, he didn't want to take the kids. He just didn't want to. It just wasn't. And he was a person who had agreed to something he hadn't really agreed to. He just agreed to it in order to move on. So that kind of thing can really blow up a nesting arrangements. And the other thing that can blow it up is when people are over controlling. Like mom has a certain bedtime and dad lets the kids stay up and watch TV on a school night. Well, I think if parents agreed about parenting, that would be a big reason for them not to get divorced. They're not going to have the same parenting styles. So there has to be some way of accepting that you can't reach over the fence and control what your co-parent is doing. And if you're able to do that, then the nesting can work. But I've seen things really break down because of that. And of course, it doesn't really change when they move to two homes because the parents will still do what they want to do.
Right. Trying to micromanage what's happening in the other parent's home or when the other parent is on duty, whether it's in the nest or not, is very, very difficult and stressful, and you'll never be happy. So you talk about in the book something like the good enough parenting plan or something to that effect. And it has to be good enough that you're each feeling the kids are safe, right? And you're being heard and you two are communicating well, but there also has to be some freedom to be parent the way you need to parent.
Yeah, the kids their routine is unchanged. They're not packing and moving every few days. Their lives are more stable. Parents who really have very different parenting styles or don't want to co-parent can still have a parallel parenting agreement and nest. They can still do that. And so sometimes people think if you're nesting, you have to be really cooperative and really co-parenting closely. And actually, that's not true. If you agree that you're going to have more of a parallel parenting plan where there's kind of a firewall between you, you can also nest successfully. It's just that you're respecting that firewall.
And you need a lot more of those agreements, and you need to comply with them and follow them for that firewall to be, stable enough, right?
Mm-hmm.
To keep you parallel.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can totally visualize that, right? Is there some ideal schedule for nesting for the children that they see their parents? Is it age? Is it based on their age? Like how often the new parents are coming in or out of the nest? I mean, not the new parents, but the parents are coming in and out of the nest. What have you found in that regard?
It's a great question because it really does depend on age. So, there's this phrase, frequent and continuing contact with both parents. That's, I think, a legal term that the research has shown that especially for young children, frequent and continuing contact with both parents is what is going to ensure a secure attachment to both parents, right? But as kids get older, they can tolerate longer periods of time. So for really young kids, and I've worked with nesting parents with newborns, and that's a like every other day kind of thing. But as kids get older, they can tolerate, 2 or 3 days. And then by the time they're in school, they might be able to do a 2-2-5 schedule, which is something that is probably the most popular schedule that I see. My ex and I did a week on, week off schedule, and my youngest at the time was 6. And I felt like that was too long to go without contact. So we had a midweek dinner. So I think you watch your kids very closely and see how they're doing with this schedule. It's hard on parents. There's no question that the coming and going and packing and unpacking is hard on parents. But I think that in the long run, when the kids start doing it, the parents have a lot more empathy for them because they know what it's like. Right. And if their child forgets their homework at the other parent's house, they're not going to lose it. They're not going to blow up about it. They're going to be more empathic because they've had that experience of trying to live in 2 places.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I have mentioned that to talk to clients about that. based on information I received from former clients. So there's so much to think about. I think anyone who's thinking about nesting, your book is excellent place to start and really think it through and look at themselves and ask themselves some questions and think ahead and look at the a plan. Make a plan. That's it. Make a plan. Stick with the plan, and make sure you're going into this level-headed. So I think this has been really helpful, and I'm so glad you got to come on and talk with me about this. And so as you know, I end every episode with a better divorce tip. So I would love to hear, what is your better divorce tip?
Oh, stay out of court.
Hey.
Does everybody say that?
Nope.
Yeah. No,
everybody says something different. I've never heard the same tip, but that's my tip all the time, right? Stay out of court. So do what you can, work with the right team.
Put your kids first.
Yes.
Always put your kids first. They're the canaries in the mine.
Yes, they are. Well, thank you so much, Anne. It's been really a pleasure having you on the show. So where can people find the book and you? If people wanted to reach out, what can they learn more?
My website is drannbuscho.com. It's drannbuscho.com. And they'll find a link to the book there. They'll find all kinds of other information about nesting, and I have a blog there too. And I'm pretty happy with the way that website is. I made it just because the book came out, so I got rid of my other website.
Yeah, your blog is great. Your Psychology Today column is wonderful. You write a lot, so lots of great information out there from you.
Yeah. I have over 2 million reads now on my blog on Psychology Today, and it warms my heart to think that people are being helped by this, or at least being provoked to think about something in a new way, and so that's very exciting. I upload a new article every 2 weeks, and it's called A Better Divorce.
We're the Better Divorce Sisters. How's that? Oh, I'm so happy to have you here today, and thank you so much. Everyone, this has been another episode of A Better Divorce podcast. Thank you for tuning in, and we will see you on the next episode.
Thanks for having me.
You've been tuning in to another episode of A Better Divorce podcast with Andrea Vaca. Thank you for subscribing, leaving your positive comments and reviews, and sharing the show with others. You can watch episodes at vacalaw.com, YouTube, LinkedIn, and Facebook. And you can listen through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and more. Bye for now, and remember, you can have a better divorce.